Some symbols are designed to be seen painted on flags, etched in gold, stamped on currency. They are declarations, safe, recognizable, controlled. But there are other symbols, those not meant for the eyes of crowds, symbols born in silence, transmitted like a whisper, felt more than understood. These are not decorations, they are disturbances. They don't belong on thrones. They belong in thresholds, in places between things, between breath and word, between dream and waking. And when such a symbol appears, you don't just look at it, you feel it looking back. That's the kind of symbol kings feared, because it couldn't be co-opted, it couldn't be printed on coins, it didn't reinforce power, it unraveled it. It didn't tell you what to believe, it questioned belief itself. This symbol, the one that vanished from stone, from scripture, from memory, was never just a mark. It was a mirror that showed things not even rulers were ready to see. Not all symbols are meant for the public square. Some were meant for initiates. Some were meant for dreamers. Some were meant to wait quietly until the world became empty enough to see again. And when that symbol appeared in the corner of a mosaic, in a dream drawn unconsciously, in the way branches split across a window, people felt it before they named it. They paused. And in that pause, power began to tremble. Because when a person sees something that was meant to be hidden, something older than empire, older than scripture, they start to remember a version of truth that does not ask permission. That is what this symbol carried. Not a message, a memory of something you were before you became what the world required. That's why it was feared. Not because it was foreign, but because it was too familiar. And not all symbols survive being seen, but this one didn't need to. It only needed to be felt once, and it would live there quietly forever. It didn't come with a name. It wasn't part of a language. It had no assigned meaning, no official doctrine, no priest taught it, no king claimed it, and yet people recognized it. Not with their minds, with something deeper, older. There are symbols that act like signs, they tell you what to do, but this one didn't tell. It remembered. It bypassed intellect, slipped under reason, entered like a dream, and stayed like a feeling you couldn't shake. It was a shape, simple yet disarming, balanced yet wild. Some said it looked like a spiral. Others saw a lattice. Some saw nothing until it showed up again and again. In branches, in rivers, in wounds, in breath. It was not invented, it was discovered, and that made it more powerful because no one owned it. The moment you saw it, you began to feel watched. Not by an eye, by awareness itself. Like it wasn't just a mark, but a mirror turned quietly toward your soul. You didn't know what it meant, but you knew it meant something. Something personal, something forgotten. And that's what made it dangerous. Because a symbol like that one, without dogma, without hierarchy, without borders, can't be managed. It spreads like silence, like a question, like fire that burns without flame. You can outlaw a flag, you can burn a book, but a shape that bypasses belief, that lives in instinct and memory, you can't erase that. You can't reason it away, you can only try to hide it. That's what the kings did. They didn't argue with it, they buried it. Because something that lives outside the system, something that awakens people without explanation, is more dangerous than an army. And this symbol did exactly that. Not because it was violent, because it was alive. Power isn't afraid of swords, it's afraid of ideas that don't die. A sword you can break, a voice you can silence, a rebel you can imprison. But a symbol, a true one, lives differently. It doesn't need to be spoken. It doesn't need a leader. It doesn't even need to be remembered clearly. It only needs to be felt, and it will begin to grow on its own. That's what kings feared, not symbols of loyalty, but symbols that created loyalty to something greater than the throne. Because the moment a person carries a symbol stronger than fear, you lose control. The forgotten symbol wasn't tied to revolution. It wasn't drawn on protest signs. It didn't belong to any side. It belonged to consciousness itself. And it did something far more subversive than incite rebellion. It awakened a different kind of freedom, the kind that doesn't need permission, the kind that doesn't ask for laws to change because it doesn't believe they define truth. The kings could not predict it, could not trace it, could not legislate against it without naming it, and naming it would make it real again. So they buried it, not in books, in silence. They carved it off walls. They altered myths. They burned scrolls that hinted too closely. They whispered that it meant nothing so that no one would dare look deeper. But they knew the truth. The greatest threat to any empire is not an enemy. It is a memory that won't stay dead. A memory of something before thrones, before orders, before fear. That's what this symbol touched. And it didn't come with a battle cry. It came with a pause, a breath, a realization that your life was not shaped by the rules you thought were real. It opened a space inside people, small at first, barely a crack. But in that crack, the light returned, and with it, everything began to shift. The symbol was carved once, onto stone, into wood, woven into fabric, etched into the margins of books that no longer exist. It was placed in temples, on walls, inside amulets, hidden where only the attentive would notice. But when fear grew, they began to erase it. Chisels were taken to the old inscriptions, stones defaced, scripts rewritten, priests instructed to never speak of it again. It didn't take long. The official record went quiet. The symbol disappeared from texts, from architecture, from common speech. And, for a time, it worked. People forgot what it looked like. They couldn't draw it. They couldn't describe it. It faded from history the way smoke fades from a battlefield. But it never left, because symbols don't live only on surfaces. They embed themselves into movement, into rhythm, into dreams. People began to see it where no one had drawn it, in cracks on a wall, in the way roots split stone, in cloud patterns, in the geometry of what had no name. It appeared in dreams, subtle at first, just a flash, just a sense. But when they woke, they carried something, an image they couldn't explain, a shape that felt like it meant something they used to know. And so they began to sketch, not to recreate the symbol, but to remember it. One stroke at a time, one curve, one dot. What had been removed from stone was returning through the unconscious, because the kings had erased the surface, but they had missed the root. The real symbol had already moved inward, into the psyche, into the body, into pattern. And pattern is harder to kill, because you can't outlaw what no one knows how to describe. You can't ban what returns as intuition. This was the mistake of control. They thought removing it from matter would remove it from mind. But the symbol had already passed through both, and now it lived in memory without name. And memory without name can't be silenced. It can only wait. Not all symbols are static. Some symbols are alive. They don't just represent, they become. They are not signs you follow. They are seeds you carry. This forgotten symbol was one of them. It didn't just mean something, it did something. The moment you saw it, truly saw it, something planted itself in you. Something small, unnamed, but growing. And like any true seed, it didn't demand your attention. It worked silently, patiently, beneath the surface. You didn't notice the change at first, only that the world looked slightly different, only that you began to question what you once accepted. That's how symbols like this move, not with noise but with roots. They settle into the soil of your attention, and then they grow your perception from the inside out. They don't push you to act, they shift how you see, and from that new sight, new choices emerge. The kings feared this not because it was rebellion, but because it couldn't be traced. There were no speeches, no groups, no commands. Only people who began to wake up with a different posture, a different light in the eye, a new kind of silence beneath their speech. People who remembered something they didn't know they knew. People who could no longer believe in what they used to serve. That's what this symbol planted. Not violence, not chaos, but sovereignty. And sovereignty is dangerous to any system that relies on submission. So they erased the symbol, burned it, banned it. But by then, it had already taken root. Because some symbols are more than shapes. They are programs that run quietly inside you until you are ready to act without being told. Not in opposition, but in remembrance. That's what this symbol always did. It didn't shout, it unlocked. And what it unlocked could never again be locked away. T begins like this. A child draws a shape without knowing why. A stranger sees a pattern that feels eerily familiar. An artist paints something they've never studied, but somehow always knew. No one names it, but everyone feels it. The shape is returning, not through conspiracy, not through design, through pattern recognition deep in the collective. It appears where no one planned, in embroidery, in glitch art, in the folds of cloth, the cracks of stone, the scars of history. And each time it shows up, something flickers in the subconscious. I've seen this before. I don't know where, but I know it. The symbol never really died. It receded, like a tide, waiting for the shoreline of the mind to become still enough for its edges to re-emerge. And now, as the noise of the world grows louder, something ancient rises quietly beneath it. The return is not dramatic. It is organic. It spreads not like fire, but like memory. And each time someone rediscovers it, draws it, wears it, dreams it, they aren't starting a movement. They are joining one that never stopped. That's the strange power of forgotten symbols. They return not when they are summoned, but when they are needed. When the world forgets itself, when the structures become too tight, when the soul begins to ache for something it can't name. Then without warning, the shape begins to reappear. And those who see it don't just see a symbol. They feel a thread, a connection to something older, truer, more them than their name. The kings feared this moment, the moment the shape would return, not as ideology, but as recognition. And now it's happening. Not on banners, not in temples, but in sketchbooks, in shadows, in the way someone pauses when they see it just long enough to remember who they were before forgetting began. A sign tells you where to go. A symbol tells you where you already are. Signs instruct, symbols reveal. That's what made this one different. It didn't give commands. It held up a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous in kingdoms built on illusion. When you look at this symbol, You don't learn something new. You remember something old, a truth not taught, but known. It doesn't point outward. It draws inward, deeper, into a place beneath words, where thought hasn't yet been shaped by approval. That's what kings feared. Not the image itself, but what it reflected. Because those who saw it began to change not in ideology, but in orientation. They started to see through the surface of things, through ritual, through obedience, through power masked as order. And when people begin to see, they begin to listen differently, not to voices of authority, but to something quieter. Something that had always been there just beneath their roles, their masks, their borrowed names. The symbol didn't tell them what to do. It reminded them of what they already were. And that kind of remembering can't be legislated. It can't be censored. It doesn't organize itself into rebellion. It simply shifts the axis of identity. You stop asking for permission. You stop needing agreement. You stop pretending. You see? And then you act differently. Not because you're told to, but because the old behaviors no longer make sense. This is the mirror's gift, and its danger. That's why this symbol was never carved onto crowns, why it was banned from holy books, why it was chased through history and erased wherever it bloomed. Because it didn't serve systems, it served awakening. And awakening is never safe for those who build their power on sleep. Control thrives on patterns, but not the sacred kind. It needs the kind that can be measured, charted, contained. Control doesn't fear strength. It fears the unmapped, the wild, the unspoken, the unpredictable. And this symbol it did not obey. It didn't serve the calendar, the throne, the priesthood. It didn't rise in revolutions. It rose in silence. And silence is hard to rule. That's why kings feared it. Because it wasn't rebellious, it was indifferent to systems of power. It didn't ask permission to appear. It simply appeared in the wrong hands, at the wrong times, in the minds of people who were supposed to follow, but suddenly began to listen inward. Power cannot predict that. It can model behavior, but not awareness. It can measure actions, but not intention. This symbol activated the one thing empires cannot manage: inner clarity. Not doctrine, not belief, but something more elusive. A feeling that truth was elsewhere and always had been. The people who saw it didn't riot. They paused. And in that pause, they began to choose differently. Not out of anger, out of alignment. And that kind of shift, that quiet recentering, is what kings fear most. Because when people stop reacting and start remembering, control slips. They become harder to herd, harder to sell to, harder to scare. And the symbol didn't organize this. It simply reflected it. It gave no instructions, only mirrors. And mirrors don't revolt. They simply show you what you've refused to see. That's the true threat. Not resistance, recognition. Because once a person sees, you can't make them unsee. And once a person knows that truth doesn't come from outside, they don't need the king. Not to bless them, not to name them, not to keep them safe. They already carry what the symbol awakened. And that, for any power structure, is unthinkable. This symbol, the one erased from stone, feared by thrones, and passed through silence, was not invented. It was discovered. Like a rhythm already written into nature, like a spiral in a shell, a galaxy, a fingerprint. It didn't come from a culture. It came from pattern itself. Not as a belief, as a structure, a sacred geometry that underlies not what we think, but how the world is. That's why it had no name. It didn't need one, because it was everywhere. In the folds of leaves, in the bones of birds, in the way lightning branches and rivers split. It was not a symbol we gave to the world. It was the one the world had been giving to us all along. And some part of us knew. That's why, when people saw it, really saw it, they felt a kind of recognition that couldn't be explained. Not a remembering of knowledge, but of being. As if the symbol didn't describe something, but reflected you back to yourself. This is why it was dangerous. Because systems are built on symbols that separate. Flags, borders, labels. But this symbol united not as a nation, but as essence. It spoke not to your name, but to your structure. And when people began to feel that, to see themselves as part of a shape older than language, they became harder to fracture. You cannot divide those who remember they are built from the same original pattern. The kings feared this because it collapsed control at the root, not by tearing it down, but by revealing it was never real. That's what this symbol did, and still does. It doesn't demand. It doesn't destroy. It unfolds, quietly, steadily, like the curve of a shell, like the path of breath, like the return of a truth you never had to learn because it was always there. Beneath belief, beneath fear, beneath every mask. The shape beneath all shapes. History likes to bury things. It calls it progress, calls it civilization. But what it often does is hide what can't be controlled. The symbol was buried, erased, denied, not because it was false, but because it was true in a way that frightened those in power. And the truth is, you don't bury what is meaningless, you bury what is alive. What they tried to remove wasn't just a shape, it was a seed, a portal, a mirror. And when they pushed it down deep into silence, into forbidden books, into the half-remembered language of dreamers, they thought it was over. But the symbol didn't die. It descended into culture, into memory, into the body. And from there, it began to grow again. Like an underground fire slowly heating the earth above it, like a song you haven't heard since childhood, but can sing anyway. Because what was buried wasn't forgotten, it was protected. Held safe by the ones who still listened, the quiet ones, the ones who drew it in the margins, who traced it into sand, who carved it into their breath when words were no longer safe. And now, something is shifting. The ground is loosening, the cover is cracking, and from beneath it, something familiar begins to rise. People don't know how to name it, but they feel it. In the pause before speech, in the silence between movements, in the urge to remember without knowing what was lost. That's the symbol, calling itself back from the depths. Because it was never destroyed, only delayed. And now, as the noise grows louder, and the systems strain, and the self begins to hunger, the forgotten symbol is returning. Not to save us, not to lead us, but to remind us of what we never truly lost. Rebellion doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like remembering. Not marching, not shouting, but pausing, becoming still, breathing into a shape you can't explain but have always known. This is the rebellion the kings feared, the kind that doesn't storm the palace, but renders it irrelevant. The kind that doesn't organize in the streets, but gathers quietly in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Because the moment you remember who you are, what you are, you become very hard to rule. Not because you resist, but because you no longer belong to the structures that require your forgetting. That's what this symbol always carried, the memory of sovereignty. Not the political kind, not the ideological kind, the kind that lives in the body, the breath, the still center that needs no title to be true. To draw it now in the sand, in the mind, in the margin of a notebook is not an act of defiance. It is an act of remembrance. It says, I know there is something deeper than fear, something quieter than command, something more permanent than power. And it is this remembering that shifts the world not with noise, but with clarity. Not by destroying, but by dissolving everything that was built on forgetting. This is not nostalgia, it's not mysticism. It's a reunion with a truth that never left you, just stopped seeing it. And when you do see it again, when it appears in a dream, in the architecture of a tree, in the spiral of smoke, or the center of your own silence, you'll know what to do. Not because the symbol tells you, but because you are finally listening to what has always been yours. The kings feared it. The world tried to erase it. But it lived, and it lives still, where it always has, inside you.